Hi, this is Alex Alsop from the LOVELAND Technologies team. We're a mapping company based in downtown Detroit, and we wanted to take some time today to try to explain a massive problem that the city of Detroit faces, the people of the city of Detroit face in 2015, tax foreclosure. So this is a unique to Detroit problem that kind of flies in the face of some of the popular narrative of the city that we've seen perpetuated in the media and other places recently, kind of saying that the city has turned a corner, that we now face questions that maybe any redeveloping city would face around access to economic development opportunities, inclusivity of quote-unquote old and new Detroit, the standard questions of gentrification. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. And there's a massive problem that the city faces this year in 2015 that is a reflection of the financial crisis. The conditions of the financial crisis are still playing out in the city, and tax foreclosure is a problem that affects tens of thousands of properties across Detroit, and still is not widely understood, still is not come to light in the media and at the level that we think it needs to. So we wanted to try to explain it a bit here. So to kind of jump right into it, what we're looking at in 2015 in Detroit are 62,000 properties citywide that are headed to tax foreclosure, meaning that they have not paid taxes in at least 3 years, property taxes in at least 3 years, and will be foreclosed on by Wayne County. And ultimately, some portion of those properties, more than half almost certainly, will wind up at a foreclosure auction at the end of 2015, where they'll be auctioned off for $500 a piece to the highest bidder. That is, if nothing is done in the interim. So, it used to be that we knew about that much about the properties that were going to foreclosure every year in Detroit. We knew where they were, we knew how many there were. But last year, LOVELAND Technologies and Data Driven Detroit, along with a number of other partners, participated in a project called Motor City Mapping, where we actually went out and surveyed every property in the city, collecting information on which were occupied, which were vacant, which had fire damage, which had dumping, and putting together a comprehensive picture of what's happening with every property in the city. That information can now be used to shed a lot more light on issues like tax foreclosure. So we now know that of the 62,000 properties subject to tax foreclosure in 2015, about 37,000 are occupied structures. At a census average of about 2.75 people per household, that means that something like 100,000 Detroiters are living in properties that are slated for tax foreclosure this year, about a sixth of the city's population. So to step back and think about where this comes from a little bit, because it's very tied up in the financial crisis, which is over, but we're still feeling. So where this comes from is a law that was passed in 1999 called Public Act 123. I'm not going to get into it right now. It's too in the weeds. If you're interested in the legislative history here, there's a great book from University of Michigan called From Revenue to Reuse, which really gets into the legal underpinnings of the foreclosure process, which is statewide. It's all of Michigan. So we're just going to look at the numbers here in Detroit and see what happens when the financial crisis arrives. So from 2002 to 2008, what you're seeing in this graph here are the number of properties that went to the foreclosure auction, the last-ditch effort to recover unpaid property taxes, and the number that actually sold in the foreclosure auction. So the total number is there in black, and the number that sold is represented in green. So these are high numbers, 2,500 to 5,000 properties a year, but it's nothing like what we see when the financial crisis hits. And what happens is, properties in Detroit, their value already depressed, the city, already strained for jobs and opportunity, really hits a inflection point where property values just collapse. The way that the system is set up, adding really onerous 18% interest every year on unpaid taxes, encourages people to just walk away from these properties by and large. So there's a huge surge in the number of properties headed to these foreclosure auctions, and as you can see, they don't get bought by by people in very high numbers. About 50% every year of properties that wind up in the foreclosure auctions in Detroit don't sell. And when they don't sell, they're transferred to the city of Detroit, which has, on top of everything else that it has to do to maintain the city, has to now maintain tens of thousands of properties that have been tax foreclosed and nobody wanted for $500 a piece. So from 2002 to 2014, 111,000 tax foreclosures around the city, 46,000 of which sold at auction, and 53,000 of which were transferred to the city of Detroit's ownership that are now, by and large, still owned by the city of Detroit. And where that brings us today is a picture that is not very encouraging when it comes to property tax collection and participation in the payment of property taxes. And what you're seeing here are still, again, the effects of the financial crisis still playing out. This is a 3-year process to foreclose on a property that hasn't paid taxes. So what we're really seeing reflected today in 2015 are the conditions of 2012. And every year that this continues, it perpetuates a further decline of properties, not selling at auction, deteriorating, going vacant. And it leads us to what we see today, where of 384,000 properties across the city, only 35% are paying taxes. Another 15% have not paid taxes between 1 and 3 years, about 60,000 properties. So they're not yet eligible for tax foreclosure. They haven't hit that 3-year mark, but they're on track to become tax foreclosure properties potentially. And then 16% of the city, 62,000 properties, are headed to tax foreclosure in 2015, absent any kind of intervention. And then 97,000 properties are already owned by the city of Detroit. Again, almost all of these are properties that did not sell at tax foreclosure auctions and the city has inherited. And to look at the numbers here of what's actually owed amongst these properties, we can zero in on that 16% that are headed to foreclosure this year. They owe $326 million, of which $228 million is the principal, and the rest is interest that's accrued over the years. So there's just a huge amount of money that's tacked on top of these properties via this 18% interest that's accrued year by year when you don't pay your property taxes. And then the physical effect of all of this is enormous. These are properties seen through Google Street View as of 2009, and Google Street View is a really interesting way to understand the impact of tax foreclosure on properties across the city. They started driving the city collecting imagery in about 2008, right at the moment of the financial crisis. So we have this incredible archive of the physical deterioration of properties that go through tax foreclosure. So here are 3 properties in 2009, a couple of which maybe are occupied. One in the center looks like it's probably vacant. 2011, one of them's burnt. They're all definitely vacant. 2013, completely overgrown, and all of these, again, tax foreclosures. 2009, 3 occupied houses. 2011, one of them's gone vacant. They'll all go through tax foreclosure in the next 2 years. 2013, 3 vacant houses. 2009, again, and I think this flies in the face of a kind of common narrative in the popular national media, which is that Detroit has kind of looked like this since the 60s, that the city's always been in rough shape, and it's turning a corner now and starting to improve. But the reality is that was not the case. The financial crisis unleashed this incredible wave of devastation. There's a group in Detroit that calls it a hurricane without water, which I think is a really apt name for it. And a lot of that is powered by the engine behind that is tax foreclosure. These are all tax foreclosed properties. So if we want to zero in on one street in particular just to see the impact of tax foreclosure on occupancy, on people actually living in these houses, this is a street out by City Airport where in 2008 there were 19 occupied houses and 3 vacant houses. Follow this graph through the foreclosure crisis, through the financial crisis, and today, as of August 2014 at least, there were 14 vacant houses on the block, 7 occupied houses. So these numbers just completely inverted. And if you tack tax foreclosure on top, you'll see that it tracks right along with vacancy. So where there is tax foreclosure, there will be vacancy. Where there's vacant property, there will definitely be tax foreclosure. These numbers are just so closely intertwined. And it certainly bears out across the entire city. Using Motor City mapping data, if we look at just the properties that we surveyed that from street level had some indication of a problem, either in poor or suggest demolition condition, they were vacant, fire damaged, needed boarding, something like that. Of the 58,000 properties that we surveyed across the city that had those kind of blight indicators, 50,000 of them were affected by tax foreclosure. Either they were currently subject to foreclosure, they're going to be foreclosed, or had been foreclosed in the past. So there's just this massive overlap of blight and foreclosure. Blight, yes, but more important than blight is vacancy. People leave when their property is headed to tax foreclosure. So tax foreclosure is not just a pipeline of blight, it's a conveyor belt out of the city. It's just, we've seen this. If history is any indication, these 37,000 properties that are being noticed for foreclosure right now in 2015, if there's no intervention, if most of them wind up going to the foreclosure auctions as we see year after year, they're going to go empty. People are going to continue to leave the city. So we have 100,000 people living in homes that should be foreclosed, and they owe a total of $211 million in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest. So we're left with this kind of stark equation. What do we want, 100,000 people or $211 million? And $211 million is a lot of money, so it's maybe worth thinking about, how much of that could we actually collect? So we have information on all of this for the last 3 years of properties that went to the foreclosure auction. What did they owe and what was actually collected? So we'll look at 2012 through 2014. And what you see here is the number in red in each of these years represents the total amount of taxes, penalties, and interest owed by properties that went to the foreclosure auction each year. And in black, the amount that was actually collected. So 2012, there was $239 million owed in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest for the properties that went to the foreclosure auction, of which $32 million was collected. So you see this year after year, and it's just an indication that it's so clear that this process is not working. Of $691 million owed over 3 years of unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest, we only succeeded in collecting $107 million. So there's a $500 million collection gap. So these properties, if you look at them, look at the individual properties that are kind of underlying this, what you see are largely, properties that sold shortly before the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, 2006, for decent amounts of money, $70,000, $90,000. They now are worth significantly less. They're worth certainly much less than their assessed value even states, and they owe $12,000, $11,000, $17,000 in taxes. There's just no economic reason why you would pay that. There's no incentive. There's no reason. It's a completely untenable proposition, which is why people, I think, leave. So this equation of 100,000 people or $211 million starts to seem a little bit different. We know that we're not going to collect that $211 million, that only a fraction of that is actually collected through the foreclosure auction. So we're looking at something more like, well, do we want 100,000 people or do we want $50 million or $30 million? So it doesn't seem worth it. So where we are in time now is there are 62,000 properties that have had foreclosure warnings tacked to their doors. On March 31st, all of those properties that don't get on a payment plan, that don't pay their back taxes, that don't do something to address this problem will be foreclosed, and they'll actually be owned by Wayne County. Between March 31st and the beginning of the first auction in September, there will be a period where people can try to still redeem their properties, get their properties back from the county, and if they fail to in September, all the properties that still have not paid their taxes will go to auction, first for the total amount of back taxes, penalties, and interest owed, and then finally in the second round of the auction for $500 a piece. And the auction dates there are approximate. We don't actually know when the auction will happen, but it'll be sometime in September, October. So this is both a massive problem and a massive opportunity. There are two ways of looking at this. Detroit cannot recover as long as tax foreclosure continues in its current form. It's an existential threat to the city. The revival of the 7.2 square miles around downtown is very impressive, is great, but it's not going to sustain 132 square miles that are empty. It can't. So we need to address this problem. We need to keep as many people in the city as we possibly can. This is also an incredible opportunity. Tax foreclosure can do some interesting things if we treat the system differently. I mentioned earlier that when a property goes through tax foreclosure, its back taxes and penalties are actually wiped out if it fails to sell in the auction. It can then be handed off to the city of Detroit. You could pursue that intentionally. You could bundle together. You could use a technique of saying, if you're going to buy one property in this auction, you have to buy all the properties. And you could bundle together, every occupied residential property headed to tax foreclosure, say, nobody bid on this. And when it comes out the other side, the city of Detroit could sell those properties back to the inhabitants for $1, for whatever, for $500. They could sell those properties back to the people who are living in them, and it would clear the slate of taxes that are owed. So that's a pretty radical notion, but there are interesting things that you can do to kind of turn the tax foreclosure system on its head. If you'd like to understand more about tax foreclosure in 2015, or if you'd like to get involved and try to lend a hand, there are a couple things you can do. First of all, you can always email Loveland at team@makeloveland.com, TEAM@makeloveland.com. You can also go to detroit.whydon'tweownthis.com, and when you get there, you're going to see this map that I've shown a couple of times through this video that displays all of the properties headed to tax foreclosure in 2015. We'll keep updating this as the numbers change, as the properties change, and you can click right down into a neighborhood from this map and see color-coded all of the properties that are headed to tax foreclosure by what's going on there based on data collected in Motor City Mapping. So these blue properties are occupied, the red are vacant, yellow possibly occupied, and green are vacant land. You can click on any one of these to see a photo of the property, information about it, see its tax status. And as I said, one of the big problems with tax foreclosure in Detroit is that there's still this enormous information gap. The best thing in some cases that you can do is to reach out to your neighbors. If you see people who are facing this, try to help them, connect with resources, be friendly, try to be approachable. It can be a sensitive thing, but there's a lot of information that people don't have and need help connecting with. So that's one way to help a lot and get involved. Thanks for your time.